"Don't let that dirty mechanic anywhere near my jet," Ethan Whitmore said, his voice cutting through the private hangar like a clean blade. And just like that, every sound seemed to pull back. The hum of the overhead lights, the faint ticking of cooling metal, even the distant whine of a taxiing aircraft beyond the glass walls. All of it shrinking into a tight, breathless silence while Naomi Carter stood 3 feet from the Gulfstream's left engine, her hands dark with oil, her sleeves rolled, her posture steady as if none of it had touched her at all. Not the word, not the tone, not the way a few men exchanged quick smirks as if they had heard something expected, something normal, something already decided about her before she ever spoke. But Naomi didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't even look at him right away. Instead, her eyes stayed on the nacelle, on a faint discoloration most would miss. A subtle heat bloom near the panel seam, the kind of detail that only revealed itself if you knew where to look and, more importantly, if you knew how to listen. Because engines didn't just show problems, they whispered them, in temperature shifts, in pressure fluctuations, in patterns that repeated like quiet warnings. And Naomi had spent years learning that language in places where no one cared to listen, long overnight shifts, empty hangars, manuals read under flickering light, moments where her only company was the sound of machines cooling down after long flights. So, when she finally lifted her head, her voice came calm, almost too calm for the tension in the room. "If this aircraft takes off in 20 minutes, you're going to lose stable cabin pressure before wheels up." A ripple moved through the group. Not panic, not yet, just discomfort, the kind that comes when something doesn't fit the script. And Ethan let out a short laugh, sharp and dismissive, adjusting the cuff of his jacket like the conversation bored him already. "You get that from a forum, or something," he said, and someone behind him chuckled. But Naomi had already stepped closer to the engine, her fingers lightly brushing the metal, not touching for show, but confirming, tracing the story the machine was telling her. "Left bleed air regulator," she added, her tone precise now. "Anchored, secondary pressure instability. It's subtle, but it's there." And for a moment, no one moved, not the pilot standing by the stairs, not the supervisor holding the tablet, not even the ground crew who had seen enough to know when something was about to shift. And the hangar seemed to hold its breath, the air thick, suspended, waiting for someone to either shut her down or prove her wrong. But Naomi didn't push, didn't raise her voice, didn't try to win the room. She simply stepped back half an inch, eyes still on the engine, as if she had already said everything that needed to be said. And now it was up to them to decide whether they were going to hear it or not. Lucas Reed did not move at first, but his eyes shifted, just slightly, from Ethan to the engine and back again. The kind of hesitation that only happened when instinct started arguing with authority. And in that narrow gap, something fragile opened in the room. Because Lucas had flown this aircraft across 3 continents, had trusted its systems at 40,000 feet, and there was a look on Naomi Carter's face that did not match arrogance or guesswork. It matched certainty. The quiet kind that came from knowing exactly what you were hearing even when no one else could hear it yet. And that unsettled him more than any alarm ever had. "We already ran diagnostics this morning," the supervisor, Helen Brooks, said, her voice controlled but tight, tapping the tablet in her hand as if the data inside it could anchor the moment. "No critical faults reported." Naomi did not look at her. She simply tilted her head a fraction, listening again. Not to sound but to absence, to the pattern that should have been there and was not. "Diagnostics do not always catch pressure instability at idle," she replied, steady, respectful, but unyielding. "It shows up under load, and by the time you see it in the air, it is already too late to ignore." The words landed differently this time, not as a challenge, but as a warning shaped by experience, and Lucas felt it settle in his chest, heavy and uncomfortable. Ethan exhaled sharply, impatience creeping into his posture now, checking the time on his watch as if that alone could force reality to move faster. "We are not delaying a flight because of a theory," he said, his tone colder, sharper, meant to close the conversation, but the silence that followed did not obey him. It stretched instead, thin and tense, and Lucas found himself stepping closer to the engine, not fully committing, not yet, but enough to show that the balance had shifted, even if only by an inch. Naomi noticed, but she did not acknowledge it. She only pointed, precise, to a section near the panel seam. "Open it," she said quietly. 30 seconds. Helen hesitated, her fingers tightening around the tablet, calculating. Risk in real time. Delay versus safety. Protocol versus instinct. And for a moment she looked not at Ethan, but at Lucas, because in the end, he would be the one in the cockpit, the one responsible for every decision once the wheels left the ground. Lucas swallowed, then nodded once, small but decisive. "Open the panel," he said, and the words seemed to echo louder than they should have, because they broke something invisible in the room, a line that had held until now, and suddenly the ground. Crew moved, tools in hand, unscrewing fasteners with quick, practiced motions, each turn of the wrench sounding sharper than usual, metallic clicks stacking into a rhythm that drew every eye toward the engine. Ethan did not step back, but he did not step forward either, caught in that narrow space between control and doubt, his jaw tightening, as if he could will the outcome to prove him right. Naomi stood still, her hands at her sides now, no longer touching the aircraft, no longer needing to. Because whatever truth was inside that panel was about to reveal itself without her help. And as the final screw came loose and the panel shifted, a faint, almost imperceptible scent slipped into the air, something sharp, something wrong, not loud enough to alarm, but clear enough to anyone who knew what it meant. And in that instant, before anyone spoke, before anyone confirmed it out loud, the entire hangar understood that the story was no longer his to control. The scent sharpened as the panel opened wider, not overwhelming, not dramatic, but precise, like a warning written in heat and metal, and Lucas Reed leaned in just enough to see it. A hairline fracture along the regulator housing, thin as a thread but unmistakable once your eyes adjusted to it, and his breath caught in his throat because it matched her. Words too closely to ignore, pressure, instability. He murmured under his breath, not announcing it, just confirming it to himself, while Helen Brooks stepped forward, her tablet lowering slowly as the reality in front of her replaced the certainty she had carried minutes ago. She did not speak immediately, because numbers and diagnostics did not prepare you for the moment when something invisible became undeniable, and behind them, the ground crew exchanged glances, subtle but charged, the kind that passed between people who knew they had just witnessed something shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Ethan Whitmore remained where he was, but the stillness around him had changed. It was no longer the controlled silence he created with authority. It was the kind that forms when control slips without permission, his eyes fixed on the exposed component, searching for contradiction, for anything that would restore the version of the moment he had expected, but there was nothing there to argue with. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation, just the quiet presence of a flaw that had been named before it was seen, and that fact settled heavier than any accusation ever could. Naomi Carter did not move closer, did not step into the center of the attention that now pulled toward her. She remained where she had stepped back, her hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady, not triumphant, not defensive, just present, as if this outcome had never been in question. To begin with, and Lucas straightened slowly, turning toward Ethan with a look that carried both professionalism and something deeper, something like respect redirected. "We cannot take this aircraft up like this," he said, his voice even, but firm, the decision already made in his mind. And Helen nodded once, the motion small but definitive, her earlier resistance dissolving into protocol, into responsibility, into the recognition that what had just been revealed could not be undone by pride or schedule. "Ground the jet," she said, her voice steady again, but different now, aligned with a truth she had not authored, and the words moved through the hangar like a quiet command. Technicians stepping into motion, checklists shifting, timelines collapsing and reforming around a new center, and through it all, the silence returned. But it was not the same silence that had followed the insult. This one carried weight, consequence, and a subtle awareness that something more than a mechanical fault had been exposed. Ethan's jaw tightened, his hand hovering near his watch again before dropping, because time no longer belonged to him in this moment. And when he finally looked at Naomi, really looked at her, not as a label, not as a role, but as the source of what had just unfolded, there was a pause, brief but unmistakable, where recognition began to take shape, unspoken, uncomfortable, and impossible to reverse. The movement around the aircraft picked up speed, but it did not feel rushed. It felt redirected, like a current changing course beneath the surface. And Naomi Carter finally stepped forward again, not to take control, not to claim anything, but because there was work to be done, and that had always been the only thing that mattered to her. She reached for a clean cloth, wiping a thin line of residue from the exposed housing before pointing again, more precise now. "It is not just the fracture," she said, her voice low but carrying through the hum of activity. "The regulator is compensating, but the secondary line is already stressed. If you replace only the housing, it will fail again within 100 flight hours." Helen Brooks looked up from her tablet, this time not to challenge, but to follow, to understand, her eyes tracking exactly where Naomi indicated, and for the first time since the moment began, she asked a question instead of giving an answer. "What do you recommend?" The shift was subtle but undeniable. Naomi did not hesitate. "Full regulator replacement. Inspect the secondary pressure line for micro-fatigue, and recalibrate before release." The terms came out clean, measured, grounded in experience rather than theory, and the technician nearest the panel nodded almost immediately, already reaching for the correct tools as if her words had slotted into a system that made sense. Lucas Reed watched this exchange in silence, but something in his posture had changed, his shoulders less rigid, his stance less divided, as if the uncertainty that had hovered over him earlier had settled into clarity. And when he spoke again, it was not to question, but to reinforce. "We follow that," he said, glancing at Helen, who gave a short nod in return. The decision now shared, anchored, and moving forward without resistance. Behind them, Ethan Whitmore remained still, but the stillness was no longer neutral. It carried weight, awareness, and something quieter, something closer to reflection than reaction. His eyes followed Naomi as she moved with deliberate precision, checking connections, confirming readings, speaking only when necessary. And there was no performance in it, no attempt to prove anything further, only competence expressed through action, and that, more than the discovery itself, began to shift the atmosphere around him, because it left no space for dismissal, no angle for superiority. Only the steady presence of someone who had been right for reasons that had nothing to do with status. The overhead lights cast long reflections across the polished floor, catching on tools, on metal, on the faint sheen of oil that marked Naomi's hands. And in that quiet interplay of light and motion, the hangar felt different, not divided anymore, but aligned around a single reality that had emerged piece by piece. And as the first components were removed and set aside, as the process unfolded, exactly as Naomi had described it would, Ethan took a slow step forward, not enough to interrupt, not enough to reclaim the center of the moment, but enough to stand within it, to see it clearly. And though he said nothing, the absence of words carried more than anything he could have added, because for the first time since he had walked into the hangar, he was no longer looking past her, he was looking at her, and that change, quiet and unspoken, settled into the space like a second kind of revelation, one that had nothing to do with machines and everything to do with what he had failed to see before. The rhythm of the work settled into something steady, controlled, almost quiet again, but beneath it there was tension, not loud, not chaotic, but sharp and constant, like a wire pulled too tight, because every movement now carried consequence. Every adjustment confirmed that what had been uncovered was deeper than a surface fault. Naomi Carter leaned slightly into the open panel, her fingers guiding a flashlight beam across the secondary pressure line. And there it was, a faint ripple along the tubing, barely visible unless you knew how to look for stress beneath smooth metal. "There," she said, not raising her voice, but every person nearby heard it, and the technician beside her paused, then nodded slowly, his expression tightening as he followed the line with his own eyes. "Micro-fatigue," he murmured, almost to himself, the words hanging in the air like a quiet admission. Helen Brooks stepped closer, no longer observing from a distance, her tablet now lowered completely, forgotten at her side as she focused on the exposed system. And for a moment she did not speak, because what she was seeing was not just a missed detail, it was a chain of oversight, small decisions stacking into something that could have gone unnoticed until it mattered most, and that realization pressed into the room with a weight that no one could ignore. Lucas Reed exhaled slowly, his hand resting briefly on the edge of the panel, grounding himself in the reality of it. "If we had taken off," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of earlier tension, "we would have seen fluctuations before climb." He did not finish the thought. He did not need to, because everyone there understood what came after that. Understood the margin for error, narrowing at altitude, understood how quickly something subtle could become something serious. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with the awareness of what had almost happened and what had just been prevented. Naomi straightened, stepping back just enough to give the technician space. Her job in that moment not to dominate but to guide, to ensure the process moved correctly, and she spoke again, calm, precise. "Replace the regulator first. Then recheck the line under pressure. Do not assume stability until it holds under load." Her words were not instructions shouted across a hierarchy. They were contributions, grounded, practical, and accepted without resistance. The crew moved quickly now, not rushed, but focused, aligned around a solution that had been built from her insight. And through it all, Ethan Whitmore stood just behind them, no longer separate from the scene, but not fully part of it either. Caught in a space that felt unfamiliar, because for the first time, control was not something he could assert with a word or a gesture. It had shifted to something earned, something demonstrated, and that unsettled him in a way he could not immediately define. His gaze moved from the exposed engine to Naomi, then back again, tracing the path of what had unfolded, and there was a tightening in his expression, not anger, not quite regret, but something closer to recognition, the kind that arrives without invitation and refuses to leave. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of the sharp edge it carried before. How long would it have held? The question was directed toward no one and everyone at once. But Naomi answered without hesitation, without dramatics, just the truth as she saw it. "Long enough to get off the ground," she said. "Not long enough to trust." And that sentence settled into the hangar with a finality that no one challenged, because it did not need to be argued. It only needed to be understood. And in that moment, the tension that had been building did not explode. It resolved, not into relief, but into clarity, the kind that changes how a room feels, how people stand, how they look at one another. And as the replacement process began in earnest, as tools clicked into place and procedures followed one after another, the realization remained, quiet but unshakable, that the outcome of this day had turned on a single voice that had refused to stay silent. The noise in the hangar softened as the replacement process moved into its final stage, not because the work had slowed, but because the urgency had transformed into focus, each technician knowing exactly what came next, each step following the one before it with quiet precision. And Naomi Carter stepped back from the engine completely now, wiping her hands on a clean cloth, the faint sheen of oil still catching the overhead light as she leaned against a nearby workbench, not resting, just allowing space for the system to be tested without her hovering over it, because she trusted the process once it was aligned correctly. And for a moment, there was nothing for her to say, nothing to correct, nothing to prove, only the low hum of recalibration equipment and the occasional click of metal settling into place. Lucas Reed stood a few feet away, arms loosely crossed, watching the pressure readings stabilize on the portable display, numbers rising and holding, not spiking, not dipping, just steady, exactly as they should be. And he let out a slow breath he had not realized he had been holding, his shoulders easing as the tension that had gripped him since the first warning began to release. Helen Brooks glanced between the screen and the exposed components, her expression no longer tight, but thoughtful, as if she were replaying the earlier moments in her mind, tracing the point where certainty had shifted into doubt and then into understanding. And behind them, Ethan Whitmore stood in silence, the kind of silence that did not demand attention but carried its own weight, his gaze no longer scanning for errors or contradictions, but resting on the scene as it unfolded, absorbing it piece by piece, the movements, the confidence, the absence of chaos, and most of all, the presence of someone he had dismissed too quickly, too easily. And that realization settled into him not as a sharp impact, but as something slower, deeper, like a quiet correction taking place beneath the surface. Naomi remained where she was, her posture relaxed but grounded, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the display, confirming what she already knew would happen, and there was no pride in it, no visible satisfaction. Just a calm acceptance of a problem solved the way problems were meant to be. Solved, through attention, through patience, through respect for the details others overlooked. The hangar lights cast long reflections across the polished floor, stretching toward the open aircraft, and in that stillness, the contrast between earlier tension and present clarity became almost tangible, like the air itself had shifted, and when the final reading locked into place, steady and consistent, one of the technicians gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal completion, enough to confirm that the system would hold under load, that the risk had been removed, that the aircraft was no longer carrying a hidden flaw waiting to reveal itself at the worst possible moment. Lucas stepped forward, placing a hand lightly against the fuselage, not out of habit, but out of acknowledgment, as if recognizing the machine for what it was now, safe, reliable, understood. And he turned slightly toward Naomi, his voice quiet but clear. "It is solid," he said, and she gave a single nod in return, no words needed, because the work spoke for itself. And in that quiet exchange, something settled into the space between them, a shared understanding that did not need to be explained. While behind them, Ethan remained still for one more second, then another, as if gathering something he had not expected to need, before finally taking a step forward into the light, not to reclaim control, but to stand. Within a moment that had changed without asking for his permission for a long second, no one spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been shown, and Ethan Whitmore stood there, the polished confidence he had carried into the hangar now replaced by something quieter, something less certain. His gaze fixed on Naomi Carter, as if seeing her for the first time without the filter he had applied so easily before, and the weight of that realization did not come all at once. It unfolded slowly, in layers, in the way the room had shifted without him, in the way decisions had moved forward without his command, in the way the people around him had listened to her, trusted her, followed her, and that was something he could not ignore, no matter how much he might have wanted to. He took another step forward, the sound of his shoes against the polished floor softer now, less sharp, and when he stopped a few feet from her, there was a pause, brief but real, where words seemed to hesitate, not because he did not have them, but because the ones he was used to using no longer fit the moment. Naomi did not move to meet him. She did not step closer or look away. She simply stood as she had before, grounded, present, her hands clean now, but still marked by the work she had done, and the contrast between them was still there, but it no longer carried the same meaning, because what had just happened had rewritten something deeper. Then appearance. Ethan exhaled slowly, his voice when it came lower, stripped of its earlier edge. "You knew before anyone else," he said, not as a challenge, not even as a question, but as an acknowledgment, and Naomi gave a small nod, not claiming anything beyond the truth. "The signs were there," she replied, her tone even. "You just have to listen for them." The simplicity of the answer landed harder than anything more elaborate would have, because it left no room for excuses, no space to hide behind complexity. It was not about luck, it was not about guessing, it was about attention, about respect for the work, about seeing what others overlooked, and Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition of that gap, the one between what he had assumed and what was real, and for a moment, the hangar seemed to narrow around them, the background noise fading into something distant as the focus settled on that exchange. Lucas watched quietly from the side, saying nothing, because this was no longer about the aircraft. It was about something else entirely, something that could not be measured in pressure readings or repair times. And Helen Brooks stood with her tablet at her side, her earlier authority now softened into something more reflective, as if she too understood that the lesson in front of them extended beyond procedure. Ethan glanced briefly at the engine, now closed, restored, functioning as it should, then back at Naomi, and there was a shift, subtle but unmistakable, in the way he held himself, not diminished, but adjusted, like a recalibration taking place beneath the surface, and when he spoke again, there was no trace of dismissal left. "I should have listened," he said, the words simple, direct, and heavier than they sounded, because they carried with them everything that had come before. Naomi did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because the moment did not require a quick answer. She let the words settle, let the silence hold them in place, and then she nodded once, not as acceptance or rejection, but as acknowledgment, the same way she had acknowledged the machine earlier, with clarity, without excess. And in that quiet exchange, the final shift completed itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, leaving the hangar filled not with tension, but with a new kind of stillness, one shaped by understanding that had arrived too late to prevent the moment, but just in time to change. What came after the silence did not break immediately after his words. It stretched instead, soft but firm, as if the hangar itself needed a moment to absorb what had just been said. And Naomi Carter did not rush to fill it. She simply looked at Ethan Whitmore, with the same steady calm she had carried from the beginning, not weighing his apology, not measuring its value, just acknowledging that it existed. And then her gaze shifted back to the aircraft, to the work that had already moved forward without needing permission, because for her, the moment had never been about being right. It had always been about making sure the problem was solved. And that difference hung quietly in the air between them, more powerful than anything spoken out loud. Ethan seemed to understand that, at least in part, because he did not try to add more, did not try to reclaim the space with explanations or justifications. He simply stood there, the earlier sharpness gone from his posture, replaced by something more grounded, more aware, and after a few seconds, he turned slightly, looking at the jet not as an object he owned, but as something he had nearly trusted too quickly, something that had required attention he had not given it. And that shift, small as it was, marked a change in how he moved within the moment. Helen Brooks cleared her throat quietly, not to interrupt, but to bring the room back to motion. "We will need a final pressure verification under load before clearance," she said, her voice steady, professional, but now carrying a tone that included Naomi rather than speaking past her. And Naomi nodded, stepping forward. Again, not into the spotlight, but into the process, her hands moving with quiet efficiency as she checked the connections one last time, confirming alignment, confirming stability. And when she spoke, it was not to assert authority, but to ensure precision. "Increase pressure gradually, do not spike it," she said, her eyes on the gauge, watching the numbers climb in a controlled, measured rise. And Lucas Reed followed her lead without hesitation, adjusting the settings with a care that mirrored her earlier attention. The system responded exactly as expected, the readings holding steady, no fluctuation, no instability, just smooth, reliable performance. And the tension that had once filled the hangar was now replaced by something quieter, something settled, like a surface that had been disturbed and then returned to stillness, the kind of stillness that comes from knowing everything is where it should be. And when the final verification completed, Helen gave a short nod. "It is cleared," she said, the words simple, but carrying the weight of everything that had led to them. And for a moment, no one moved, not because they were unsure, but because the significance of the moment lingered, not in the aircraft, but in what had changed around it. Ethan looked at Naomi again, and this time there was no hesitation in his gaze, no distance, just a clear recognition of what she had done and what it had meant. And though he did not repeat his earlier words, he did not need to, because the way he stood, the way he allowed the moment to settle without trying to control it, spoke more than anything he could have added. And Naomi, after one final glance at the now stable system, stepped back once more, her role complete, her presence no longer required for the process to continue, but leaving behind something that would remain long after the aircraft left the ground, something that had quietly reshaped the space, not through force, not through argument, but through clarity, precision, and the kind of quiet strength that does not demand recognition, but earns it anyway. The final checks cleared one by one. Quiet confirmations spoken under breath, hands moving away from the aircraft as if releasing something that no longer needed to be held, and the hangar returned to its natural rhythm. The low hum of systems, the distant echo of movement beyond the glass. The kind of normal that only comes after something has been set right. Naomi Carter gathered her tools slowly, not rushed, not lingering, just methodical, wiping each one clean before placing it back into her kit, the same way she always did. Because for her, The end of the job was part of the job, and nothing about what had just happened changed that. She did not look around to see who was watching, did not wait for acknowledgment. She simply worked, and that quiet consistency seemed to anchor the space more than anything else could. Lucas Reed stood near the wing for a moment longer, then turned toward the cockpit stairs, pausing just briefly as he glanced back at Naomi, giving a small nod, not formal, not exaggerated, just real. Before continuing on, Helen Brooks resumed her position with the tablet, but her posture had shifted, less rigid, more aware, as if she were carrying forward something that would influence the next decision, the next inspection, the next moment where certainty might need to be questioned. And near the center of it all, Ethan Whitmore remained still for a second longer than everyone else, watching Naomi as she closed her toolkit. The metallic click of the latch soft but distinct, and there was something in that sound that seemed to mark the end of more than just a repair, because it signaled a boundary, a completion, a line drawn between what had been and what now was. He took a step forward, then stopped, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that saying more was not what this moment required, and instead, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture small enough that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not looking for it, but deliberate enough that it carried meaning. And Naomi, as she lifted her kit, caught it in her peripheral vision. She paused for half a breath, then gave a single nod in return, not as acceptance, not as agreement, but as recognition, the same quiet acknowledgement she had given the machine, the same steady response she had offered throughout. And then she turned, walking toward the edge of the hangar where the light shifted from artificial to natural, the late afternoon sun stretching across the concrete in long, warm lines, her silhouette passing through it without hesitation, without looking back, because there was nothing left behind that she needed to claim. The aircraft stood ready now, restored, silent, its earlier flaw erased not by chance, but by attention, by patience, by a voice that had chosen to speak when it would have been easier to remain invisible. And as the hangar doors reflected the fading light, the space settled into stillness once more, not empty, not quiet in the way it had been before, but full, shaped by a moment that did not announce itself, did not demand to be remembered, yet would linger all the same, in the way people looked at one another, in the way decisions would be made moving forward, in the way a single, steady voice had shifted everything without ever raising itself above the truth.